Hey, this is Resilience Radio. I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me or Resilience Occupational Therapy. Every person has their own individual healthcare needs, and not everything is going to resonate with everyone. Additionally, none of this is meant to be medically prescriptive or diagnostic in any way. Today's episode is one of a short series of episodes that I'll be doing with my interviewing of Gil Hedley, who is a really amazing dissection artist, for lack of a better word. He's a scientist he's really done a lot of work with cadavers. So if discussion of cadavers and dead bodies is something that upsets you, maybe this isn't appropriate for you. But in any case, he is a Rolfer and has done a lot of dissections, including the dissections that became the anatomy trains for some of my structural integration training. In this episode, we're talking about Ida Rolf's contribution to structural integration and our understanding of fascia, and what Gil's more nuanced understanding from his research over the years and dissections over the years to how fascia actually works and what he wishes Ida Rolf had known back then. So as someone who's a scholar of the body and embodiment and anatomy, what do you feel Ida Rolf's contribution to the field was?
Oh, she's huge. I mean, she's like the mama of so many practitioners. And she, of course, she brought attention to fascia, although I'm not sure many people really know what fascia is. So they have ideas about it, and they have ideas about what they're doing to it that may or may not be super accurate. But that's okay. You got to start somewhere. And I feel like she, created a consciousness around that. And also, a way of working that wasn't like shooting for, say, good feelings in a moment, which are super valuable in themselves, but for a long-term change. So I think, both of those elements are pretty huge when you think about it, because as a sort of ignored, forgotten, or underrated aspect of the human body, I think her efforts to bring fascia into consciousness certainly brought it into my consciousness, and that's been another 30 years trying to bring it into people's consciousnesses, along with a whole slew of other people. So it just created a world of interest in that. I don't think there'd be a international fascia congress meeting every 3 years if it weren't for Ida Rolf having brought it into the consciousness of her community, which has grown and has tendrils in all the bodywork forms at this point.
So could you speak to fascia? What sort of the broad level overview, and then some of the misconceptions?
Well, I mean, we have an element in our body that's sort of the negative of filling the negative space of our conceptualization of the musculoskeletal body, right? So you look at an anatomy chart, from the anatomical chart company that's hanging in every massage school, every Rolfing program, everything, everywhere, and there's no fascia in the picture. And so I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Defining fascia and
Oh,
misconceptions.
Yeah, misconceptions. So one misconception would be that it's an inert, dead packing material, some acellular wrapper around the body that's irrelevant and discardable. Another misconception would be that it's one thing, that fascia could be put into a single box. So fascia is really just a category and a taxonomy, beneath which can be represented a number of different types of tissue. And so I think a misconception that folks can carry easily if you don't look into it a little more deeply, is that fascia is one thing, and that one thing is the plantar fascia, or some, just a super tough silvery band, is a IT band, and then that becomes your sort of poster child for what fascia is. And then you approach a human body as if it's only full of that, and beat on it, which can be a problem, right? Because you're thinking, well, I need to morph that IT band in your arm and your face and your belly, as if everywhere there's this outrageously dense fibrous matter, when there is a whole range of dense regular fibrous fascia that one could incorporate into one's understanding of fascia. And in addition, there's not only dense regular fibrous fascia, there's also, say, membranous types of fascia, right? Or fatty types of fascia. And so if you expand your conceptualization of fascia to include several different types of fascia, which in themselves have variety, that you can make an accounting for in the body consistently, and I have, then you will touch that stuff differently. You won't just be a one-size-fits-all connection with a fantasy of fascia in your mind. And that's why I've tried to make it visual for the last 30 years. Can I make this visual so people can see it either in person or, in videos and such, so that folks can say there's a whole lot of different kinds of dense regular fascia. Some of it's tightly packed, some of it's more spread out, some of it is kind of a combo of membranes and stringy bits. Sometimes there's no stringy bits at all to account for. They're very small, and it's more like a felted, translucent, wet membranous tissue. Or maybe, depending upon your nomenclature, you may or may not count the subcutaneous adipose as fascia, but Henry Gray did in the English tradition. And so I was taught, 30 years ago, to call that superficial fascia. And I continue to do so, although I'm cognizant of the different nomenclature used in Europe, et cetera. But basically, when you start looking at, aggregates of connective tissue that can be dissected into a sheet and call that fascia, which is our, sort of our standing definition for a fascia in the fascia community, then you can see that there are really different types of fascia, and that they, as far as I'm concerned, you'd be foolish to touch them all the same way. And you might even consider what your target is more carefully when you have a better understanding of physiology and anatomy and location of those different types of fascia.
So you've learned a lot since your Rolfing days about the body.
If
you could go back in time and share something with Ida Rolf that you discovered that you wish she had been aware of, so that people learned about it earlier and had been disseminated earlier, what would you share with her?
I think the first thing I'd say, after thank you, and you've been a marvelous mother to a great community, the first thing I would go for is that while I do believe the body is a plastic medium, as I think she said that the body is a plastic medium, or maybe fascia is a plastic medium, I would have shifted her attention from the dense regular fibrous fascia to the, what I call perifascia, or membrane system, in which that dense regular fibrous fascia is embedded, because I think that's where the immediate impact of touch is actually taking place when you're working with fascia. So you might grind your elbow around on somebody's deep fascia intentionally, but I'm not convinced that lengthening or changing that tissue can be a short-term objective. And I know many people work in a way that give you the impression that they're trying to mold that tissue in the short term, like in the moment. And that results in a lot of heavy-handed work that I don't think is always of service. And although I know Ida Rolf was very heavy-handed, I think she was also clairvoyant and could see what she was doing, and so could get away with it in a way that her non-clairvoyant pupils We're just imitating her heavy-handedness without it being necessary. And so there's a place for heavy-handed work, but it's not the only way to go. And my feeling is that the perifascia, or the membrane system, let's call it, in which the dense regular fascia are embedded, is what Rolfers are accidentally working on, whether consciously or not, and that's where they're getting.
So that the real mechanism you're saying is in this
Is in the membrane system.
The membrane system.
That's right. That, in other words, you can get a change out of that in pretty short order, though, and that's going to change the context in which those dense regular fibrous fascia live, and they will change over time. And I always understood that as a Rolfer, that the changes that I was hoping to initiate in my sessions were going to unfold over time. And that's why you don't keep Rolfing somebody week after week for eternity, because you've sort of set something in motion. But I did see changes that were immediate, in my sessions, and I wanted to account for that. Like, why can I get such a quick change? It's not because I'm an elephant grinding away on the IT band, It's because it's what I kind of like. I would put your elbow on somebody and you kind of lean into them for a while. You make that contact, you make that connection, and you hang out there for a little while, and then you start to kind of like swim around a little bit. Like, what's going on there? You think, oh, I'm following the tissue or whatever. Well, actually, in my mind, your elbow is a hockey puck, and you put it down and you contacted it into the ice, right? And you're thinking, ice being the analogy for the deep fascia, or the dense regular fibrous matter that's constituent in our body. You connect to that, but then you're in gravity too, and you can't maintain the exact same pressure or connection with that ice cube, right? And so what happens is you shift, and when you shift, you start to slide, right? Because every hockey puck isn't sliding on the ice itself, it's sliding on a film of water, right? Between the rubber and the ice. What is that film of water in this analogy? It's the membranes. It's the membranes in which the dense regular fibrous fascia are embedded. So when you kind of pull back just a micro something, right, in your connection, then you're going to start to slide on that membrane. And that's where the richness of the connection happens. That's where the alterations of hydration, where the encouragement of the tissue to be flushed, the nerves themselves as well that are moving into these tissues are passing along in those membranes. And so what you're actually doing is working on perifascia when you start to move. The deep, dense, regular fibrous fascia, they're like exoskeleton. They're not really supposed to be changing their length a whole lot. They're there as they are, as a representation of movement patterns and biological and genetic patterns that are meaningful. And I'm hesitant to tinker with those. However, the membranes in which they're embedded are very, is like a reservoir, like a fluid reservoir in our body that's extremely physiologically important and also mechanically important. And they're distensible, they're movable. And when you say pin someone's tissue and then call for movement, right, now you're generating a connection with the membranes on the deep side of the dense regular fibrous fascia, because the fasciculi of the muscle tissues that are also encased in the stuff and that are moving relative to the dense regular fibrous fascia, you're giving exercise and you're calling movement forth from those tissues when you make that deeper connection. So you can work on membranes above the dense regular fibrous fascia. You can work on membranes below the dense regular fibrous fascia through the techniques that we learned in my training, at least back in the early 90s. And so I feel like if I would want her to know that the richness of the encounter of the practitioner and their client, to my mind, the rich place is in the membranes, not so much in the fibrous matter. And if you just do that little shift, you're still working fascia. We're just going to change its name. We're going to call it perifascia instead of dense regular fibrous fascia or deep fascia. And you're going to keep doing your work, but because your attention is on generating a rich connection with that other, just up a little or down a little, like with that other layer, then you might, because its texture is different, connect to it differently. You might be a little sneakier, a little less heavy-handed. You might not slam on people quite so hard, because what you do when you are heavy-handed is no matter what your client is saying, do me, I really want you to get in there, blah, blah, blah. The body will defend, right? And you'll find yourself, working on someone who's practicing iron shirt qigong now, and you're grinding away on their iron shirt, and it becomes like a wrestling match on who's going to give up first, and then that exercise, that arm wrestling match, becomes sometimes a accidental objective of the session. I'm going to overpower you, you're going to give up, and we're going to call it a day, and I'm going to get paid, and we're all going to be happy and come back and do it again next week. That's it's kind of like a chiropractor who's working for the sound, rather than the movement, right? Or the stability. So, if you're working to just have that wrestling match, you're kind of missing a point. Whereas you could also be sneaking up on those membranes with all kinds of techniques. I definitely pounded it home when I did my training back in the early 90s, that Rolfing wasn't a technique. It was more of a vision or a set of principles and goals, and that the technique you deployed to accomplish those principles could be, of a great variety. And yet we all sort of ended up doing the same thing, whipping out the elbow and leaning and doing our best,
So
excuse me.
So that's what you'd say to Ida Rolf. It sounds like there's a parallel to what you might say to someone who regularly foam rolls, is working on that exoskeleton of the IT band. And what would you say more to the person who goes to the gym? They don't know anatomy that well, but they know that when they hit their IT band with that foam roller, it seems to really help everything.
Well, I'd show them a picture that I'm showing in my tour talk now, which is of the very fine branchings of the sensory nerves in the IT band, which go a long way in explaining why it hurts so bad when you're grinding around on it. But I'm not down on foam rolling at all. It would be a mistake to think I was. It's more a question of same thing. I'm not down on Rolfing. I love Rolfing, love foam rolling. It's just a question of intention and what is the model in your mind of what you're doing. Because if the model in your mind, whether you're doing it with foam rolling or doing it with someone's elbow, is that you're, inducing the thixotropic effect in dense regular fibrous fascia in order to mold it, I think that's an incorrect model. In other words, I don't think it's an accurate description of what's happening, but we act according to our model. So if that's your model, you're going to be a very heavy-handed foam roller, and you're going to be doing a very heavy-handed Rolfer, and you're going to be causing a lot of pain that might be unnecessary. And if your model is that I'm, hydrating the membrane system around those tissues, that I'm flushing them and creating a conscious connection with them, and that I'm relieving stress and inflammation on the very fine sensory nerves in these tissues, that I'm maybe inducing the thixotropic effect in the membranes, which are much more apt to yield to the touch than the exoskeleton, then I might be a little more subtle in my connection with those tissues. I might do different things. I might have a broad palm that's sort of generating slip and slide and glide, rather than it all being about my, elbow trying to morph strings. If you look at the IT band under a microscope, I have one video out in my YouTube channel called "Does Fascia Stretch?" and the finale of the video is some footage from the lab, just 30 seconds from the lab, where I put the IT band under a microscope and I'm putting it under tension, in the vertical, and you can see these dense, thick collagenous fibers sort of getting closer to each other and lining up, and they're not lengthening at all, because they don't. They're not designed to lengthen those stringy bits. They're designed to stabilize the hip and the knee relative to each other. And then I pull it in the other direction, right? I pull it in the horizontal direction, and it stretches like rubber bands are in it. And you can see these bands of collagen fibers that are organized very differently than the vertical ones, and that are like Charlie Brown's t-shirt. They're like this very tight zigzag, but then when you pull it, it goes wong, and it snaps back together. And I don't know, and to my mind, it's just a cautionary tale describing how, sometimes our intention to make something longer, and which is particularly done when you do a big broad sweep down the thigh, could be a little wrong-headed, although you will accidentally address the perifascia. And so why work by accident when you could work on purpose? In other words, if you're working with a purpose on a thing that's not responding, but accidentally facilitating a different tissue texture, a different tissue type, why not bring it into your consciousness and do it and work on that tissue intentionally rather than accidentally? Because I think a lot of the work I did as a Rolfer accidentally helped people. If I had known a little more, I could have been actually going specifically to those tissues and maybe doing even more good, because I'm not saying I wasn't doing good with my accidental work. It was kind of bound to happen that I would help people, given the basic setup of the work. And I think that was true. I think that's why the folks at the guild were like, just keep doing this thing, and you'll help a lot of people if you just do this thing. Don't get too fancy with it. Just do this thing, and you will help people. And I agree with that completely. But also, with a slightly different model and metaphor, it'll alter your techniques in a way that I think could become even more serviceable and more intentional and less accidental.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Resilience Radio. I know I really enjoyed this conversation with Gil. If you did, you can stay tuned for more videos, or check some of the other ones in our series with different structural integrators on fascia, or any of the other healthcare video interviews we have. Subscribing so you can get a new episode in your stream every week. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. Again, I hope you enjoyed listening. Take care.